Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Karen Blake, and I am the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for Community Support Network Incorporated, which is known as CSNI. Some housekeeping for this evening. We would like to encourage people to ask questions or to comment either in the chat or the Q&A. We do have closed captioning that is enabled for this webinar. You'll find that at the lower bottom toolbar. Your choice tonight if you want to have your camera on or off. And there will be opportunities throughout the presentation where we will have open questions. I'd like to introduce to all of you Mindy Huckins. She is the Senior Director of Elder and Participant Directed Services for Gateways, and it is her presentation that we will be watching this evening. Mindy, take it away.
Before I share my presentation, I like to see faces. So hi, everyone. As Karen said, Hi Scott. As Karen said, I'm Mindy Huckins. I work in Gateways Community Services, which is an area agency in Region 6 in the Participant Directed and Managed Services program. And so today's presentation is going to be about Participant Directed and Managed Services. I'm going to refer to that as PDMS through the presentation, that are going to be in effect for 7/1. This 7/1, so in 34 days. I'm sure some people on this call also have questions about how participant directed and managed services will be impacted by the BDS systems work, and that is certainly something to get informed about. Tonight's presentation is about what's happening for 7/1, so we will not be reviewing any of the rate setting or things like that for the fall or winter. We're going to focus on the changes for 7/1. So I'm going to share my screen with you, hopefully. All right, so let's see if my computer wants to work. Okay, here we go. All right, can everyone see the presentation? Cool, I got some thumbs up. Thank you, I much appreciate it. I also apologize if I don't see you, because while you're presenting, it can be a little bit difficult to see all the people. So Karen will help me out with that if need be. I am going to pause after each section for questions and answers. So again, I'm very grateful to Community Support Network Incorporated. They are always on top of what families need to know and work in great partnership with the area agency. So I'm very honored to be asked by them to share some information tonight. Okay, so the goal of this presentation is to provide an overview of the changes to the individual budgets for the developmental disability and acquired brain disorder services. The developmental disability waiver, otherwise called the DD waiver, was renewed in September of 2021. The acquired brain disorder waiver, ABD, was renewed in November of 2021. When the waivers were renewed, the Bureau of Developmental Services, BDS, wrote a new authorization process for services inside of those waivers that were approved. What it did was it removed participant directed and managed services as a service, and it's now considered just a method of service delivery. What does that mean? That means that you have access, whether a person chooses participant directed or managed services or a traditional model using provider agencies, you have the same array of services, but you do get to choose your model through traditional models of provider vendors or through a participant directed program. However, with the Appendix K, we were able to delay this new process from starting because of everything we were coping with related to the pandemic. So that has now expired, and the new authorization process will also help us with future requirements of direct billing, which for the state of New Hampshire is under corrective action from the Center of Medicaid and Medicare Services, CMS. The new authorization process must be in place by May 1st. So what does that mean? That means anybody who has a service agreement renewal, so your service agreement is ending and you're going to have a renewal that starts on May 1st or latter, this change will start to implement your budget. It will also impact people sooner if they want to change something in their budget. and or if they need an enhancement to their budget and need more funding for a particular service, you will also flip over to this, the presentation today for your budget. If your service agreement isn't till December, you won't have any changes until December unless you get an enhancement or make a significant change to your program. So that's what we're starting for right off the bat. So that's just explaining the why. And I'm going to go into very specific details. Any questions related to that, the why?
So nothing in the chat so far, and
Great.
Hands raised.
Perfect. So everybody's on the same train. Wonderful. Okay. So I'm going to go over and talk about budgets. And when I explain all these services, I'm going to review what we do now and what the change will be. That way there won't be any confusion of what we're doing. So just trying to move my people because I can't see my slides. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay, there we go. Okay, so how are budgets determined now? Currently, when yourself or the individual you care for comes into service, the area agency must submit what's called a prior authorization, or PA. The new term for this is going to be service authorization, but for the sake of what's happening currently, it's called a prior authorization. And it is the request for all of the justified services that you've been requesting. All of you have a budget unless you're coming into services, so you know this process. And this request must include a detailed service agreement, which we already do now, the budget, and supporting documentation with any of the waiver services. So if you needed a justification for a certain service, we get all of that, we submit it. This is what's happening now. And then an itemized budget for all the clinically justified supports is created, and all items are totaled into one allocation amount. So in participant direction, you have all your services that you picked and selected that are all self-directed, and then that totals up to a total budget. Annually, that budget is renewed as one total amount when the service agreement is submitted for the renewal for the PA. So if all of those things added up to $30,000 each year when your service agreement expires, your budget is approved for $30,000 total. So here's an example. Christy receives 15 hours of residential support in-home from a family managed employee or direct support professional, whatever your term is, and attends a vendor, Opportunity Networks, 30 hours per week during the day. The prior authorization is for combo services, day and residential, and then just the total amount. So it's one authorization. You'll notice here that we talked about a combo service of day and residential. If you only have one service type, like just residential or just supported employment, you will not experience as much change as everyone else. So that's the good news. Some of you might be saying right now, I have no idea what type of service I have, and that's perfectly okay. Your service coordinator will absolutely help you. They know exactly what type of services you are in. So that's what's going on currently. So let's move forward. Okay, so how are budgets determined in the new change? So this is the change. Some things are the same. When you come into service, the area agencies have to submit the prior auth request for all the clinically justified services. So everything a service agreement pays for is something that's related to the disability and justified. This request must include a detailed service agreement and budget. So that is the same. There is no change there. An itemized budget for all clinically justified supports is created, and a prior authorization must be created for each individual service listed in the budget. So just as a reminder, currently we just get one with everything bundled in at a total amount. The change will be that each service you have in the category will be its own authorization. So if you get residential, you'll have a residential authorization. I'll go through the example. Annually, that budget is reviewed and each individual prior authorization needs to be renewed. So that is also a change. So here's the example. Same example as last time, but this is in the new model on your budget. Christy receives 15 hours of residential support in the home from a family managed employee. and attends Opportunity Networks 30 hours per week during the day. So now in the new system, the prior authorizations are 15 hours of residential service, 30 hours of community participation services, and 12 months of case management, service coordination. So now you'll see there are 3 authorizations and they're each approved individually. So let's stop there and see what questions you have about that.
Okay, we'll give people a moment. If people have a question, you can raise your hand or in the chat.
I do.
Okay, go ahead.
Who applies for the authorization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So your service coordinator has already been working with your area agency to do that. And moving forward, your service coordinator will still be the one to do that. So they work with you to determine your budget and you meet and they help talk about what needs you have and what services you want, and they put it into the budget template that you guys typically use with all the individual services. So they will be working to make sure that your services, have all the individual requests, and then those will be submitted to the Bureau of Developmental Services, just like they are now. So you shouldn't experience a change on how it gets submitted. It's more just about what your service coordinator will work with you to, what we call that is unbundling of services. So each one gets their own line. Any other questions on that?
Okay, in the chat, we have a question. Can a family have only residential support without community partnership support? How many hours?
So yes, you could ask for an entirely residential program, and the hours are not defined in our waiver. They're based on a person-centered plan and what that person needs. But yes, there are people who have a full residential program with no day program. Typically, that's because the individual has barriers to being in the community a significant amount of time, have medical needs, or maybe aging, any number of reasons. But yes, that's an allowable opportunity through the waiver.
And we also have a question in the chat from Karen. If my son only has a day program for services, does that mean he is not really affected?
He will, yes. So he would not be affected in this change. There will be one other change we're going to talk about that would impact him. But yes, your service agreement, you're still gonna have prior auth, but you're just going to have that in service coordination. If you have respite or other things like that, those will also have individual prior authorizations as well. But yeah, if it's just straight day program, then yep, just one line.
Okay, we have a questions from Carol. Go ahead, Carol.
Hi, yes, my question is my daughter has the PDMS, and we have family managed employees come to the house.
Yeah.
They work with her in the house and they also take her out into the community. And we budgeted for a transportation. And then we fulfill her goals. So how many prior auths would come out of that?
So I'm assuming when she's in the home, she's providing a residential service, and I'm making the assumption that when they're out in the community, it's like community participation services, you have transportation, and you have case management. So in Mindy's PDMS math, you would have 4 authorizations. I'm actually going to get into that a little bit more about how to work with your employees. But again, I don't know your exact service, so I'm making an estimate based on what I know the definitions are for each service. So you would have 4 PAs, but it's going to be the same on your budget. We'll talk a little bit about that and how to manage your workers if they work for more than one service type. So I'll get into that in a bit.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And
I think Nancy Turner has a question in the chat as well.
Yep, we have one more from Nancy. Our service agreement was just completed in early May, but effective on July 1st. Does this new change apply?
Yes, it does.
Oh, you definitely did it out.
Well, the good news is you're learning about it before it starts technically. So,
Very good. And I don't know where it went.
And
then I think Barb S has one.
And we have questions.
Right there it is. Okay. Oh, God. Oh, boy.
Shelby, do you have a question?
No. No, I'm right here.
Okay, so in the chat, we have a question from Barb. Who approves or disapproves an authorization?
Thank you for the ask. So they just get submitted directly to your liaison at the Bureau of Developmental Services. So the Bureau of Developmental Services make those approval. It will typically be your liaison. Currently, I know the Bureau is looking at that long term, and I would comment that the only one that's probably an exception to that is environmental modifications. They typically have a different approval process where you have to do you'll see in the waiver all the things you have to do for an EMOD, and those are approved by a different person at the Bureau, but it does all go through your liaison, so they review it first. That's who does it. Sorry. Right. Any other questions, or do we want to jump back in the presentation?
I think we are good. Let's keep going, Mindy.
Perfect. All right, let's see. All right. Okay. So this is where we ended the last on the change.
You always do that, Mom.
So now I'm going to review what if you want to change a service. Okay, so you have, maybe you have residential and you have a day program, but you didn't put respite in your budget and now you need respite. Or you need assistive technology, any of those type of services. So here's what happens now. You speak with your service coordinator about whatever change was requested to the budget. Your service coordinator and family gather any documentation needed to justify the service. They write an amendment, they do justifications, you work with your service coordinator. The service coordinator changes the budget and the funds can begin immediately. As long as you have those resources in your budget, like you can afford it in your budget. So you can make those changes immediately right after the amendment is approved. Example, Christy's guardian wants to add weekly music therapy sessions to support Christy with increasing her communication and social skills. The service coordinator and guardian make budget changes using their current funding allocation. They create an amendment for the additional service and create a goal to assess the need with the justification. The service coordinator uploads the budget to our software system. This says portal because at Gateways we have a portal, but your service coordinator and your area agency update it so your budget that you get, your monthly budget report, matches these new changes. And then Christy can utilize the money allocated to music therapy right away. So that's what's happening right now. If you want to change, you find the resource in your budget, you make sure it meets criteria, you write an amendment. Once you sign it and we sign it, you can start using it right away. In the new upcoming changes, there's a couple different scenarios. So let's talk about adding a new service before your service agreement renews. So in the middle of your service agreement, you determine that you need assistive technology or whatever you need. So you're still going to speak with your service coordinator about the changes you want to the budget and about the new service. So that's not going to change. The service coordinator and family gather all the documentation, no change. The service coordinator now submits what's called a unit change request. Sometimes you might hear that referred to as a UCR to either your business office or your area agency. Every area agency has a different, formula of who it goes to, but it's within the area agency. It has to be at least 30 days prior to the service being used. The business office or the area agency submits that authorization to the Bureau for approval. So again, that's your liaison would be looking at that change, but it must be 30 days prior when it is a brand new service that you're trying to add. The Bureau approves or denies the request. Once approved, the service coordinator then notifies you as family or the individual that the service can be used. We cannot pay for anything that was paid for prior to the official approval of this change request. So it's really important as families that we don't buy something with the anticipation that we can make a quick change, because if it's paid before the date we got the approval of the Bureau, they will not let us pay for it. We can only pay from that date forward. So this is a really important communication piece for you and your service coordinator. Here's the example. Christy's guardian wants to add weekly music therapy, community integration services to support Christy in increasing her communication social skills. This will cost about $2,800 a year. So the family gathers the documentation to support the clinical justification from a licensed practitioner, which is required by the waivered service. The service coordinator and guardian or individual make a budget change. We create the amendment and create a goal for the service. So that's very similar to what we would be doing currently. The service coordinator updates the budget. We submit the prior authorization at least 30 days before the services are set to begin to the Bureau of Developmental Services. The prior authorization is approved and the service coordinator notifies the guardian and individual that the service can begin. So the biggest change here is that if you want to add a brand new service, a service you don't already have a line for in your budget, you have to plan for 30 days in advance. The Bureau, per the rule in the waivers, have up to 30 days to approve that. Now, it might not take 30 days. Maybe they do it in 2 days, which would be wonderful, but they do, through statute and waiver, have the ability to wait up to the 30 days. And then I see some hands up. I'm just going to go through the next one and then we'll open for questions. Okay, so what if I want to change my services? New steps. So if you want to move funding between established services, okay, so last example was I do not have assistive technology anywhere in my services, and now I want it. Moving forward, if you already have that line item service, there's really no change to this process because we do not need a UCR change. We were able to work with the Bureau and advocate that that would be impossible for families to wait 30 days to move every single thing. And they agreed. So if you already have residential and you already have respite and your residential provider is taking a week off, you can move money to respite. We might still write an amendment just like we normally would, but we don't have to wait the 30 days and we don't have to submit a unit change, a UCR. We can just move money like we currently do now with the amendments and anything that we need. So if you already have those line items, you can move money just like you can now. So I'm going to pause here and answer questions.
Our first question is from Kathy Spinney. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hi, Kathy.
Hey guys, how are you? Okay, so when I listen to you talk about the program changes and the 30-day advance notice, what I hear as a family is that's more onerous for the family because we are people who planning long-term is a luxury. And for certain kinds of services, sometimes something is presented to us and it's like, if you don't sign her up today, we're going to fill that slot.
Sure.
So I'm disturbed by this removes flexibility and puts more on the family in terms of having to secure documentation and, you know, it's not agile.
Kathy, we absolutely hear you. That same feedback was provided, you know, when they were talking about these changes. And a lot of the advocacy was at the time they were saying this UCR would apply for even if you moved 1 cent. So it was for every service. And so we were able to give a lot of feedback and the Bureau really understood from the family perspective that it doesn't, there was a disagreement about whether it, if it's a change to families. And I said, yes, they can still access their service, but it is a change in the, you know, how speedy you can get that change. And that's the point of participant direction, that you can move money when you need to. So at this juncture, they're saying they removed the other request and that you can still do that, but for anything brand new. And what they are recommending, and your service coordinator will certainly do the best to work with you, is that we really think and plan for services in advance and talk about what might come up. So that we can avoid some of the things. If we look over last year's services and what might have happened, do we want to consider? I think in the past, when we've come into service agreements, you know, we can amend them anytime. So there's a lot of flexibility and we still can do all of that. But we might want to really think when we go into the service agreement, what might we need over this next year? And let's try to get that in the service agreement in the budget now. So it's already an existing line item. But you're absolutely right, Kathy, that it does, you know, as far as the, you know, documentation, that's something that hasn't changed because you would always need that for any approval. But as far as, you know, your flexibility to have a quick response, which is why many people choose participant direction, it definitely could be seen as a barrier. And I do encourage everybody to communicate with the Bureau and continue to advocate. The last slide of this presentation is where you can go to advocate and where you can get more information. And part of the reason why CSNI thinks this is so important is that we know it impacts you. This presentation is really to make sure we are educating everyone about how will it impact you? Will it even impact you, so that you can advocate or make decisions that are educated for your program. So I appreciate your feedback, Kathy.
And Mindy, has the Bureau given a valid reason for doing it this way, for removing flexibility from families? Has anyone asked them, and what is the reason? It's not.
It's related to how the service authorization process was, the way they would documented it in the waiver, which the developmental disability and the acquired brain disorder waiver, it's also in the IHS waiver, but we're not talking about that today because they've already unbundled their services. That's how it was written. And when you need a new service, they're really trying to monitor utilization and make sure that we're using services that we're actually using and those types of things. I think, sometimes people put something in a budget and it sits all year not being used versus asking for it when we need it. And there's many, many reasons why people do that. I completely understand it. So that's really where they are at, but I do encourage, people to ask the Bureau, those questions and certainly get your family from a family feedback, perspective. Many families have been advocating, but I think, we've been trying to explain as, service providers, like, I know how this will impact the families. Like, I know immediately how it will impact them. So we're there, but it's going to take voice of families. And what I will say is that when it came into IHS, they tried the same thing and in-home supports waiver, and we were able to come to some agreements mid-year once we started to say, like, this is not going to work. So they were really able to look at it and work as partners to fix it. But I know that the amount of time that it's not working is not easy for families to cope with or individuals to get their needs met. So
it's just troubling when you are taking the free workforce you have that you take for granted and make it harder for them. And that is not historically how the Bureau used to behave. So it's troubling. Thank you,
I
Mindy.
think it's important to know that, like, I want people to know, and I know CSNI does as well, these changes, because your service coordinator is going to be acting in a different way. And we want to make sure people understand that, like, these are not decisions your service coordinator is making or your area agency. This is the required process, because it could create friction between those entities being like, what do you mean? So we really want to make sure that people understand where the guidance is coming from so that we can continue to work collaboratively. So
thank you, Mindy.
Thank you.
Okay,
Kathy.
we have hands raised, and we also have questions in the chat. Kelly E had a question about 10 minutes ago. I see that she also.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kelly.
Yep. So Kelly, do you want to ask your question quickly, and then we'll get to Jennifer Bertrand? You muted, my friend. Yep.
Sorry. Is the 30 days a guarantee that they'll get back to you within 30 days, or is that flexible? And my other question was, like, how long would it take before you get your money? And apparently you're supposed to ask for it 30 days in advance, but I was wondering if there's a guarantee that within the 30th day you'll get your answer. Like, if I want to do something new, like, I know you don't pay for something like recreational, but if I want to do something else that I wanted to do, and then I have it in my goals and my ISA and everything, I don't think they're actually taking 30 days. I think they're taking longer than that for answers to come back. I'm not really sure of that. I can't say how I know that, but
those are great questions. Thanks for asking. So it's important to know that the waiver specifically says, all the waivers specifically say that a decision will be provided within 30 days. So what I would say is, the Bureau has communicated that their hope is to approve things prior to that and to do them sooner. They have been hiring additional prior, staff and things like that to prep for these increased authorization approvals. But I would say that, I hoped it wouldn't come to this, but after the 30 days, it is potentially a violation of the waiver, and that might give you some avenue for advocating in a different way. They've been very clear, and the waiver is already approved. There are amendments out to these waivers, and we've been watching them closely. I encourage people, they're 277 pages, so it's somewhat unrealistic to keep up with all of it. But please be assured that your partner friends are doing that in CSNI and the area agencies to make sure none of these things are changing in a negative way and providing feedback.
Yeah, actually, I'm on the Bureau of Developmental Services Advisory Committee, and I guess it's gonna go for a few more months into the summer, because some of the stuff is happening, like you said, 7-1.
Yeah.
Some of it will probably happen after that. I'm
Yep.
not sure how long I'll be doing that, but
Yeah.
I am doing that for my advocacy piece.
That's great. I can say that recently, as some of like an in-home supports waiver and other things, as these have been coming, that we have seen responsiveness from the Bureau. But again, I think part of this is do they fully understand how many authorization changes there will be, because that's what participant direction is about. So they'll have to address that as they come, but I know that they understand it and they're gearing up, and that's their plan. But I would say that it is written and approved by the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, so you would be able to use that as a advocacy point if your PA prior authorization was not approved in time. The Bureau could also come back to us to ask additional questions. So it also relies on how quickly we get back to them. So part of that partnership is, the service coordinator will reach out to you to say, hey, they had this additional question. If they can't answer it, to get the approval. So working in partnership with your service coordinator to get those answers back quickly will also aid in getting your approval. Sometimes they ask questions that, we didn't ask, or we never talked about. So we'll certainly keep you in the know. And like each area agency meets very regularly with their liaison. For example, our gateways, we meet with ours every Friday. So it's not like long periods of time go by. So we can check with them to say, hey, these are still pending. We're still pending these people. And we nudge them every Friday. In my region, I don't know what days other regions meet, but there is a relationship there. Kelly, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Kelly. Jennifer Bertrand, why don't you go ahead? We also have a couple of questions in the chat. Mindy, do we want to hold the rest of the questions until the next break, or just go through them?
I'm just peeking quickly at what the questions are. I think we can answer Jennifer's question and then what's in the chat, and then we'll go on to the next. The next two sessions aren't anything too surprising. It's more about like, how does this work? What are the examples, so that you know how to practically use your budget that way.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Jennifer Bertrand, go ahead.
Hi there, Karen. Thanks for facilitating our session tonight. Really appreciate that. And also Mindy, for the information that you're able to share. And I know that I heard you say that you encouraged folks to share our feedback with the Bureau. Is someone recording though the feedback, and will they be sharing it specifically with the Bureau as well?
From this presentation, Jen?
Yeah, from CSNI, maybe on behalf of CSNI.
Sure. I know, Karen, we do plan to save the chat questions to make sure that we got through all of them. Karen, I think we do have an opportunity here to share some of the feedback. Karen and I also sit on a communications committee with the Bureau and other people to talk about some of that. So we will certainly be updating them, that they are aware this training occurred, and we can certainly let them know there. I don't want to commit for Karen that, exactly what she'll send, but I think we can give them a general feedback so far that we've had from, Kathy or yourself, just about that impact, the 30-day wait impact. But
Yeah, Karen, I think any opportunity, including this opportunity, to record and provide some written feedback, so we have some historical feedback to point to if need be down the road, if we discover there's some significant unintended consequences that really are hampering families and create more burdens than families can balance. I was curious, so there's this 30-day time period in which you have to submit your request in advance. And let's say, for hypothetical sake, that your request was denied. What can parents expect to receive when they receive a denial? And I also have a question about emergencies. working at Community Crossroads. I chair our fundraising grant committee. And from time to time, we'll get an emergency request, someone's pipe burst, or something happened during an electrical storm, a tree fell down, and the family or the home care provider doesn't have any money to restore the power and electrical damage that was done. And on an emergency basis, people, would not be able to plan ahead for that, but might need an additional service in order to ensure that that individual's housing remains secured and that they don't lose a place to live. So maybe this would be another portion of your presentation, but for me, given the role that I've been in for over 10 years, I think about that and I could list off, I don't know, another dozen situations where people might not know in advance. And the 30-day situation could be problematic and it could result in someone's, food insecurity, housing insecurity, or a number of different things.
Yes, I appreciate your questions, Jenny, and your feedback. So first of all, the first thing is that I think it leads to a great question, because the area agency is given very specific guidance. It's the same guidance you all have in the waiver. It's the definitions in the waiver. It's the whatever qualifications they need, whatever, the person providing the service, any justifications they need, what have you. So at your area agency level, we are not going to submit something to the Bureau of Developmental Services that we know does not fit. So at that juncture, it may be your service coordinator saying that service doesn't meet the criteria for this reason or that. Certainly, if you have other information you want to provide, we always try to work together. If the area agency is saying, we will not submit this, then you have the right to appeal that decision to the area agency. Most of the time we have a conversation and try to work it out, consult, and just, try to work it together. But in worst case scenario, if the area agency does not submit the request, then your appeal would be with the area agency. However, if you and the area agency work together, your service coordinator writes the justification, supports that this meets their review of the waivered service and the waiver, and we send it up to the Bureau of Developmental Services and they decline it, we will ask for specific information. Why was it declined? What have you, so to see if we can fix it. But if not, at that time, the denial is coming from the Bureau of Developmental Services. So any appeal would be with the Bureau of Developmental Services directly in that scenario.
And it's my understanding that if the Bureau is to deny something, that the family would have to be provided written information, a written denial and explanation of why it was denied in writing, not from the area agency, but from
from themselves. Yes. So
and will we be able to provide so families know what to do? Will there be easy step 1, step 2, step 3 if they feel like they've been unjustly denied?
Your service agreement template is a state template and it has all that information built into it. So it tells you exactly what the process is. It actually gives you a list of people you could contact who could help you write your appeal or what have you. So that's on your service agreement standard language for everybody. And it's if you're in a disagreement with the area agency, and the same process is with the Bureau. So if the Bureau says no, we try to give them more information and see, but if they're hard on no, they would be required to provide. And they usually what comes down is, I don't have one for you guys to see, but
that's okay.
We get like an email.
I just wanted to hear from you and
yeah, the Bureau will send us something specific. It'll say denied.
It will come in writing.
Yes.
They denied, and it will provide a justification or reasoning for why they denied the service.
Correct. So your appeal process is outlined in the waiver and the rules still apply. But I just, it's like tricky to know who. Our hope is we can all work together. To answer your other question about emergency services is, as always, the waiver indicates that you can consult with the Bureau for a waiver or anything. We always work with our liaison. So if a crisis came up, we would bring it up to our liaison, and part of that conversation would be, what are our solutions to the crisis and what do we need authorized? So we would work together quickly to understand those things. But I do also want to remind people, this is only for new services. So most people already have either a residential service or day service, like a lot of those services. So you know, if it was assistive technology because it was a major safety issue, you know, we would try to figure that, you know, get the Bureau to do it quickly or see if we could get that, you know, through another, you know, a community grant or whatever we could. But they are very open to any crisis situation. And regardless, we are required to consult with our liaison whenever there's a crisis. So they will certainly.
Okay, I was curious because I had heard from service coordinators, a variety of service coordinators, at least currently, that to make a change to the service plan, it really requires like 45 days, even though we had instances where, like, for example, mom became sick or dad was injured and they needed more direct service hours. And the family wasn't able to access that in a timely way to meet the needs of the family. Is that going to be better?
I think that's their hope. One of the waivered services is actually crisis service. So for adults, so we would put together a request for crisis service with like a full description. So those get prioritized anyway. So I think that's important to know. You know, there's a number of things that we can do. Crisis funding will allow us to authorize you know, up to 4 days of service before we have an official authorization while we're working on something in an emergency situation. So there's some flexibilities there. And as always, we just consult with the Bureau and they'll help us do whatever we can as quickly as we can. So there are avenues to address crisis. Talking to your liaison and also requesting crisis funding. Any crisis funding request gets prioritized each day. So you know, I think that there are avenues. We'll have to, and when I say we'll, the families and the teams will have to report back on whether it's meeting your needs or not. And I think this is their best guess and the best process they're thinking of now. And we'll have to see how it plays out. You know, a lot of this stuff is thoughtful and intentful. It sounds good on paper, but then in real life, it doesn't actually flow that way. And we really need to be able to share that. And the Bureau will be interested in that feedback as well from what they're telling us.
So thank you so much, Mindy. So we do have questions in the chat, but I think
yeah, let's
looking at time. Why don't we hold them? Maybe hold them until the end? Because
we only have a few more slides, so I think it will really work out fine. So let me go back to sharing. Here we are. Okay, so this is where we ended. Just making sure everyone can see my screen. Oh, hello?
I can see it.
Okay, sorry, I can't see anyone. I'm like, uh-oh, am I frozen? Okay, so sorry. All right. So what do you need to know about your paid staff? Okay, so now you have your services unbundled, right? So you have your residential as its own authorization, your day program, your respite, you know, your wellness and coaching or whatever you have. So right now, your current budget that you get each month, your monthly statement, some get it more often or whatever you have listed, there's one payroll item. And it usually says like family managed employees. And then like in our region, it's separated by part-time, full-time. That's the only separation. And then you have like a big lump and it tells you how much you budgeted and how much is left. And the same as personal care and rehabilitation contracts. Some people call them parent paid stipends or individual paid stipends. They're by the IRS, they're actually called difficulty of care payments. So it's when you're paying someone a stipend who lives full-time with the person to provide direct services to the individual. Those are listed as a monthly stipend amount. So just one, you know, total amount, or maybe there's two people with a contract and they each have their amount. So here's the example. Christy has a family managed employee that provides 25 hours of support in the community for a day program. She has a residential enhanced family care provider that she lives with that gets paid a monthly stipend of $1,500 a month. What does the budget show now? Under payroll, it indicates she has an FME that's part-time that provides 25 hours. And under personal care contract, she has a monthly stipend for $1,500. So what's it going to look like in the new changes? So family managed employee hours would be listed as part-time or full-time, but also need to be broken down in these 4 categories. Now, again, if you only have one service type, this will not apply to you. But if you have residential and day or SEP and a service, you will need to break down when your FME is working based on the services. So for example, so that's your family managed employee. For the contracts, the stipend contracts in the budget, they could be broken out in 3 categories. So it could be residential, community participation services, which is also called DAHAB sometimes, and support employment. So those are the only 3 areas where you're allowed to do a stipend. For PCNH payments, you will only receive 1 stipend check monthly, even if you provide 2 or more service categories. So let's see the example again. Christy has a family managed employee that provides 25 hours of support for community participation services. And she has a PCNH provider that provides 10 hours of residential and 10 hours of community participation services weekly, equaling a stipend of $1,500. So what will the budget show now? Under payroll community participation services, it will indicate an FME 25 hours of support. So you'll have that listed there. Under the personal care contract, she has a stipend that breaks down. 750 is residential services she's providing, and the other 750 a month is community participation services. It still adds up to $1,500, but there's 2 different services with the same person, one under residential and one under the community participation services. Some of you might have seen the newer budget template and it has tabs for each service. So you'll see them broken out, but on your monthly budget statement, you'll see 2 lines in those payroll as well as any contracts, or you'll see multiple lines depending what service that they are in. So let's keep going. So your budget report will look different. In your payroll section, you'll see all types of payroll in a separate line item. So we gave some example here. Payroll residential, payroll community participation services. And you'll still have the total amount of payroll being spent, but it's going to be broken down in each section. You'll need to watch the separate line items to see if you are using one service faster than the other. So if so, you and your service coordinator may need to adjust where you put your hours. More to residential, less to day, if that's the way you're actually utilizing services. Payroll, stipends, mileage, and specialty services are services that are impacted by the unbundle. So what does that mean? Any payroll service, any contract, any mileage, and any specialty service that you might be using, specialty services like a clinician for a behavior plan or things like that, they have to be broken up by what service they're providing. And so, for example, you might have a clinician helping with a behavior plan that has 3 hours a month. So we might see 1.5 hours under residential and the other 1.5 hours under CPS because they're overseeing both programs. When you start this, your service coordinator has a good idea about how you use your services typically. Most people we've experienced at Gateways really don't have a change because a lot of families already and individuals already schedule their services like that. So even though they have day and res, they have like 1 person that does the day and like 2 part-time people that do res hours. So there's really no change because they've always been in res and they've always been in day. So it's very easy. It's really you families and individuals that have a worker that provides an array of services that we will have this kind of unbundling and you'll have to do the timesheets. So when they do their timesheets, they're going to list 5 hours CPS, 5 hours residential. So they'll know which 2 codes they'll have those on their timesheets. And you as the, supervisor or family member supervisor, whoever's authorizing expenses from the budget, when you sign those timesheets, you want to watch out for that because if they're wrong, your budget will be impacted because you'll have too much in one and maybe not enough in the other. So I'm going to pause there because that's a lot of information. But again, just a reminder, if you only have one service, this is not going to impact you. If you have a combo service, we just need to meet with your service coordinator, say, all right, what services are they providing? One good way to look at it is what goals are they working on when they're working with the individual? So if they're working on the res goal, then it makes sense that that person's in the residential services. If they're working on a day goal, then that makes sense they're there. And like we said, at Gateways, we went proactively and pulled all of our cases with all their workers. And for the most of them, we were able to make good recommendations that like, hey, based on your spending and how you usually use things, I think Mary, we're kind of guessing that Mary would be this and this. Do you agree? Is that how you want it set up? And then we'll help set it up with our payroll to make sure it's done correctly. So for most cases, it sounded terrible when we first heard it, but it really wasn't that bad. So we've kind of proactively done that. And then as cases renew, we come to the service agreement with those recommendations to the family and individual to say, is this working? Does this represent your program best, or do we want to talk about it? So I know there were questions from before. So for now, can we answer questions about the slides we just reviewed, and then I'll answer other questions afterwards. And then after this, I just have one more slide. So
Scott, go ahead.
Would this affect my transportation if with this new whole thing? Just wondering, will that affect my transportation and whatever else, or is Loretta hopefully going to go over all this and let us know what's going on here?
So I promise you, Loretta will help you and tell you what's going on. And that's a great question, Scott, because transportation could be two different things. If you are providing transportation while you are in a day program or while you're in residential, and there's a person that's driving you and then they're also supporting you at wherever you're going, that yes, that mileage would go under your day service. If your transportation is really just a ride where someone drops you off and picks you up, but you don't have you have natural supports when you go to that environment, or you can manage it yourself, that's called non-medical transportation, and that does not get unbundled. That's just a service, and you buy a taxi or whatever or mileage or whatever, that won't be impacted, but the mileage inside of a day program or residential go under those programs. Yes.
Meaning that means my aunt better keep track of her mileage.
Well,
again.
she should be anyway. She should be getting
I'll have to let her know that.
Okay, well, check with Loretta. She'll help you.
Thanks, Scott. Audrey, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Mindy.
Hi.
My daughter, we're signing and looking at her new adult service plan next week. We're under community partners. I am currently working as a fellow for the Arc of the United States.
Great.
And we're working on the access rule proposal right now on the national level. And I'm just curious to know if the state has been having any discussions around the access rule. So, and I'm getting to the point of your slide, specifically for the 80% wage pass-through to the direct support professionals. So would this affect the changes that are made in regards to the payment towards the direct care worker, and how is the state aware of the impact that it will make on the overall budget as a whole for people in PDMS?
Thank you, Audrey. I have not heard the Bureau reference any changes to anything that we have been doing about the way we pay for workers or, family managed employees or, contracts. I personally have not heard any conversation from the Bureau. There's also a statewide participant directed and managed meeting that meets every month that anyone's welcome to go to. But I have not heard them say that, and they have not indicated anything to us so far about anything like that.
Okay, thank you.
Audrey, just really briefly, because many people on the call probably don't know what the 80% rule, if you could just, a couple of quick lines on what it is you're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, it's and just to clarify too, this is a discussion. It's nothing that's put into place yet. This is coming down from CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and they are on the front-facing, idealistic thought of this is a positive thing. It's looking to be able to pay direct care workers more to make sure that they're getting more from the budgets and into, so it's going towards a livable wage for the direct care workers, which I know everyone is on board for. They do such great work. Part of some of the discussion and concern is around by giving the 80%, will the budgets be able to handle that if it's mandated at 80%? And then the 20% then goes to administration costs.
I will tell you that there's a lot going on also with rate setting and all of that based on how much, what the reimbursement rate is for the service, and all of that. And, you know, in participant directed here, and one of the things that's kind of part of this presentation, but well, it isn't, but it's important based on what you're saying, is that in the past, historically, area agencies have received you know, our resource to run the agency by general management funds. Moving forward, area agencies will not receive general management funds. They will receive a administrative rate, which they call the DADS rate, for each participant who is on a waiver to provide our services, but it does not come from their budget. So I think that feeds into what you're talking about, and it also feeds in that budgets are going to be paid at the rate, the full rate. There's no in between anymore. So, I mean, in PDMS, there hasn't been much in the future for participant direction, and that's not starting for another year. We will be paid a fiscal management rate as the area agencies to like run all the employer of record services and things like that. But it will not be coming from the budget allocations as far as GM goes. So those are some things to keep your eye on. You know, the intent, there's a lot of intent in the state to raise rates, which means you can pay people more. And that's the basis for all the rate setting work. So I appreciate that.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for bringing that up and your explanation. Okay, Mindy, it does not look like we have any other hand raised. I do want to let people know that if you have put a question in the chat or the Q&A, we will get to it at the end. But if anyone has any questions that about the slides that Mindy just went over, please raise your hand.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. We have one more slide, so it shouldn't be too long, and then we'll just kind of hit all the questions and answers. Okay, so let's see. Sometimes it doesn't want to change. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is really the last slide. What are some process impacts to people as a family or individuals or families? So, as we already mentioned, this is, I talked about before, as of May 1st, you will automatically be moved to the new budget model based on your service agreement renewal day. So whenever your service agreement is up for renewal, that's when you will flip. Now, obviously, we work on service agreements before they expire, so they don't expire without a renewal. So you'll be experiencing this, you know, earlier than the actual start date. You know, so you'll have plenty of time to ask your service coordinator, and also after the, you know, this presentation, I encourage you to go to your service coordinator and ask any questions you have specifically about your case, get some answers that you might want. But again, it's May 1st, and it's on your renewal date unless you get an enhancement or you have a significant change to your budget. So as it says here, if you receive an enhancement or are brand new entering off the wait list prior to your service agreement renewal, you will need to be changed to this new budget model due to the enhancement. So, and I'll get into in the next bullet. If you have a service program change, you're adding residential services prior to your renewal, you will need to move to the new budget model due to the new program change. So for example, if you are going to add a new service that you do not have, you will flip automatically to this new budget template. Otherwise, you'll wait to your renewal. Your changes within your current budget do not require you to flip to the new model as long as you have it's within your budget. Current FMEs and contracts will need to be split up into their designated program categories upon the change. So when your renewal happens, we talked about that. Your job descriptions moving forward, your contracts and any contracts you make with a family. Some regions use a vendor contract to kind of negotiate what they're going to work with their vendor provider. Those will need to be updated to include what hours in the category. So for example, moving forward, when you're on the new template, when you fill out the job description to hire your worker, you're going to need to indicate which hours are day, which hours are residential, so they can set them up that way when they're hired. And the same with the contracts. So we're going to say, hey, your service agreement is renewing. Is your contract fully in residential, or is it split between these? How do we want to split it? What makes sense and what's appropriate to your program? So we'll just be, your amounts don't change necessarily. You just have them split up, but their total would still remain the same. If you chose to, of course, at your renewal, you can change your, whatever makes sense. So those are things that you'll need to think about when it goes to change. And as we talked about, timesheets will need you to approve each category when they submit their timesheet, and it should be separated by the category. So for example, FME worked 10 hours CPS and 12 hours res. So they need to put that on their timesheet instead of just putting 22 hours. It needs to be separated by those categories. And each area agency uses a different timesheet system or whatever. So they'll have to review with you what their process is for your region. A lot of this is stuff to bring back to your region, and all of the PDMS directors and everybody have seen this presentation before, and we've emailed it out and what have you, so that you can start to get some processes. What's my timesheet going to look like? How's this working? And to ask them. And then really just know your service coordinator knows you and your program, and they're here to help you transition. We all know what to do. We understand all the changes and when to make them. And so you're not in this alone by any means. We're here to, as your service coordinator, to talk it through with you and help you get through it. So, it's really just service coordination doesn't make decisions about these things, but we can guide the questions for you to think about how to change your program. And also to know you can move. So if it was in residential and your res in your day really needs to change, we can do that without a UCR, as long as you already had those two services. So it's still fluid, and we know we're going to be doing our best to guess how those hours get broken out. And we just monitor it and adjust as need be, just like we do everything else. I lied and said I had one slide, but it's really just the this is just a slide about where to get the waivers. I think it's some people are really interested in the waivers. I'm like, I have to for my role, and I actually enjoy it, like really understand all the waivers. So I spend a lot of time reading them, but they are 277 pages each, and they also are not in very friendly language. So that can sometimes be a barrier, but you can also have your service coordinator can help you go through that. And then this link below, the Bureau of Developmental's the corrective action plan. If you click on this link, it'll talk to you more about why are we doing this? Why are we unbundling? Why are, what does it mean to direct bill or what have you? So that's it for the slides. So now we can just kind of leave it open to questions and answers, and I'll do my best.
Mindy, thank you so much. Okay, we have from the Q&A, and then we'll head over to the chat.
Okay.
There is, it's iPhone 4. I'm sorry, I don't know what your name is. This grandmother has 360 care of grandson, no services so far, 2 to 3 years out of high school. She has been told they don't have staff. What can she do?
Yeah, so not necessarily related to these changes, but this is workforce. I think everyone here can agree can be a challenge. And so I'm making the assumption that when you say they, you're talking about a vendor organization. Participant direction is really designed for you to also use vendors, but also really to recruit your own staff. And most people use participant direction to do so. Obviously, participant directed and managed services are best when someone or has a relationship to the person, which is why we're selecting that person to provide services. But if you don't have anybody in your circle of support that's interested, you can post ads like at Gateways. We post on Indeed. The service coordinator will work with the family to go over any of the resumes, help you interview, do some of those things. And then the other thing is that we're always looking to add support to families, not to exhaust the supports that they already have. But the waiver does permit for a, if you live with the person full time and are providing the care, for you to be paid for those services via stipend until you can find adequate work. So those are some of the things. Our goal isn't typically to pay people long-term, because our goal is to give ad support, but in a jam, those are some opportunities, and I know they don't necessarily help, but the hiring workers. The other thing we look at is like, what are some things that they could do that would take up time? Is there a camp, like in the summertime, is there a camp that's open and the camp has availability? So at least that might be 30 hours of camp, that 30 hours of support for that week. Is there a respite provider? Is there someone who says, oh, I can't do this all the time, but I could do Friday nights? So we try to use person-centered planning to really map out, what are your needs? Who do you know? What are you comfortable with? And just try to brainstorm with you how to recruit staff. And we can also, work with the vendor organization to say, do you have a timeline of when you think this service will come up? Maybe we only need to figure out a plan for 2 or 3 months. Maybe it's going to be longer, and it's important that as a family. And those are questions you always want to be able to ask. What's the timeline? And most vendors are saying, I don't know. And I think a lot of this will improve down the road as rates get changed and things like that, but it's not going to hit the ground for a while. There are some legislative approvals currently that are going through for governor's signature around Medicaid rate increases, which would potentially be in effect immediately. So there's, a little bit more resource there, which might help people to hire at a higher rate. Legacy budgets just got pushed through, which is, and Karen's better to describe these than me as the legislative person, but I know enough to be dangerous, and Karen will tell me to cut it out if I go too far. Legacy budgets are designed for budgets that are over 24 months old that have not had a cost of living increase. So there'll be an opportunity to request those services. We're still waiting for the bill to be officially signed. It looks positive. I think it might have been signed, but we're waiting for the details. Like, that's great. What's the process? But it obviously is just under review. So there's a number of things coming up, but I really would suggest you work with your service coordinator. We've had many people who prefer a vendor model transition over to participant and directed managed services, because the vendor doesn't have workforce and they have some people that they could hire at least temporarily. So, remember that too. You can go between services, service models. So I hope you have some luck. My heart breaks for you.
Thank you so much, Mindy. Okay, so we have a lot of questions in the chat. So thankful to everyone for sharing and asking your questions. So going back a bit, from Will, some of these questions may have been answered throughout your slides.
Sure.
But from Will, Mindy, awesome job. Thank you. Is there a separate change process for crisis situations, i.e. change needed immediately?
Yeah, and I think we reviewed that briefly. We can always go to our liaison. We would do that for crisis anyway. That's required to keep the Bureau in the know. But there is an ability to request crisis funds. It's actually a service in the waiver. You could read that definition about what qualifies as a crisis for crisis funding. But yes, if we needed something expedited, we would work with the Bureau directly to talk about the immediate need to get that up and running. Yep.
Okay, we had a question that was already answered, so I'm going to pop down to the next one. This is from Donna. Are they going to increase the staff at the area agencies? Because it sounds like our coordinators are going to have 3 times the paperwork to fill out.
Well, I appreciate your sentiments, Donna. I would say to you, no. At this juncture, service coordination rates will be reviewed just like all the other rates. And I think that's the way they plan to meet the need there. But in the immediate for 7-1 and for this next 6 months, we have, so it's up to each area agency how you spend your resources. So area agencies decide when they, hire or what have you. But we have not been given extra resources to hire service coordinators because with more of this work, it would be ideal to, bring caseloads down so we have much more time to do person-centered work with the families and really get things right. So it would just be adding people so that we could have lower caseloads in order to serve people with more focus. But unfortunately, that's not part of the recommendation from the Bureau. We don't have resources there. But again, those decisions are made by individual area agencies. So you should speak to your area agency about how they're going to manage it. But we were not given additional resources at this time. So.
And we had a question about the slide deck. I did put in the chat for everyone that I will be sending the slide deck as well as the link to the recording by the end of the week. Okay, next was a question that I think you answered earlier, but it's from Kathy. Will denials be in writing from BDS? To date, that has not happened for families, and families cannot appeal without it.
Yeah, Kathy, we can certainly ask for it in writing. What the area agency receives from the Bureau is whatever the service type was, and then it will say denied. So like that comes from the Bureau. It's not very detailed, but certainly we would do that, and it would be appropriate to request that in writing from the Bureau. That's something that I will certainly bring up at our service coordination meetings we have with the Bureau weekly, just to understand that piece of it, because we need to know so we can be the most supportive that we can in helping families. It is somewhat of a conflict of interest for us to write an appeal, but we can certainly guide you and make sure you have all the information that you have and have access. And I would encourage anyone to call their liaison directly to get whatever we need, but we're very happy to work with you, give you what we received from the Bureau. And I'll bring it up to the Bureau to say like, hey, we're anticipating some of this going on. What's that going to look like? And how do families get their appeal information if that's a decision that they want to move forward with? So it's a great, yep.
Mindy, can I just hop on and add something to that?
Sure.
So if for any reason going forward, as these changes are implemented and we're finding that families aren't getting direct written communication, if there's a denial, I hope that you and other area agencies will go to the department and specifically request that to go to the family. It's my understanding, based on a conversation I had with Karen Rosenberg, who is an attorney with the Disability Rights Center, that it's actually in the law that anytime there's a Medicaid service denial, that the Bureau has to provide the reasoning in writing to the individual.
Yeah, and they actually need to quote the statute or waiver where they got it. They can't like just write what it is. You have to give the exact waiver statute or what have you. So that's also something that's helpful, and I appreciate that. We certainly will be in our opportunities, but what I can tell all of you is that the voice that's heard the most, especially by legislation and anybody else, is individuals and their families. There is potentially a conflict with, the professionals in the field doing all the advocacy because they can think we have something to gain out of it. I don't have anything to gain when you are appealing the Bureau. But I can understand that, but, it'll be important too. My understanding is that there are going to be some feedback opportunities regularly to talk about how these systems changes are going, and those will be open to families as well. So we will certainly do our part as professionals. I know for sure CSNI is going to be creating, some advocacy opportunities and collecting information like they always do. But I do encourage people to get engaged with, your own, share that voice, send letters, send emails, call, your liaison, because those things are really important, and they matter. So.
Great, thank you. All right, from Amy, I would like to know the big picture here. I heard these changes discussed today are due to the fact that New Hampshire Medicaid was out of compliance. Can you tell us what specifically was out of compliance?
Sure. So the Bureau of Developmental Services and our services are under corrective action, which we call the CAP, Corrective Action Plan. And we were out of compliance in two areas. The first being conflict-free case management. And so not something we talked about today, but what that means is your service coordinator cannot work for the same entity that provides any of your direct services. So Gateway's doesn't provide any direct services, so I know we're not a good example, but there are area agencies who provide like day programs and residential, and they also provide case management. Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services says that there's a conflict innately in there because they could potentially have power to sway them to use a service that is theirs. Now, we in New Hampshire hope that that would not be the case, but the CMS's role is to watch out for the entire nation and anyone they're servicing. So we actually have been in the corrective action plan for 6 years, but because of COVID, we received several extensions, but 7/1 is a hard delivery date. So what that means is if you have case management and services by the same company, then you need to decide. You either need to get a new service coordination company or you need to change your services because you can't be provided by both. So that's one big area. And many of us, we've been working on that for years to get out of conflict. And so you can certainly, if you think that applies to you, can certainly talk with your service coordinator about what the plan is. The second area is that currently in New Hampshire, all the billing for developmental waivers and both waivers and IHS waiver go through the area agency, which is fine. That's allowed. However, states are also required to have an opportunity for provider agencies to bill directly if they wanted to, not through an area agency. So they don't have to, but if they wanted to, there has to be a way to do that. So how does that impact what we talked about today is how are you going to direct bill any section of that if the services are in one big budget and they don't have separate authorizations? So the point of having everything unbundled is that if any part of those services needed to be direct bill at some point, it's very clear what service, what authorization that person, because you could have one person direct billing one service and then all the others are still being billed by the area agency. It just depends on each provider gets to choose for themselves. But also because of direct bill, every service provider who wants to get paid, whether they're doing it themselves or through the area agency, has to enroll as a Medicaid provider through Medicaid. So you cannot use somebody who's not enrolled as a Medicaid provider. But they've been doing a lot of work on that, and most of your, typical people that you work with, any of the little services, it doesn't apply to, like, gym memberships. And I mean, you're not going to have them that the area agencies will run those billings still. So that's what we're under corrective action for, those two items. And so we must be in compliance by 7/1.
So what I will do, Mindy, is I will provide links also to BDS system transformations. So people that may be new to this information will have an additional resource.
Great.
Okay, our next question is from Vicky. How specific are we going to have to be with these bundles? So I'll offer an example. After being in the community for several hours, usually doing farm work, my daughter will want to cool off in the family pool at the end of the day in the community. If she swims with her DSP for half an hour in the family pool, would that be residential service?
I think it depends. I mean, the way you're describing it, I would say no. CPS service is supposed to be in the community, but you can have up to a certain amount of time in the home. Like sometimes people need 30 minutes in the home in the morning to prep for a specific activity they have that day, like gymnastics or whatever. So they go home to make that transition. So 30 minutes, I don't think is a huge impact. But when you go beyond there, you really want to start thinking about when that is. And again, it's not a problem. You can move money in your budget. If you determine that that does need to be under residential and you have residential, you can move that to that service if you feel more comfortable. But it really comes down to what the waiver defines. Day programming isn't that you can never be at home, but it's really meant to be very minimal. So your example seems to me innocuous. It's, not a huge deal. But if someone's going to be home for 3 or 4 hours a day in the middle, and I would not bill that under day. So.
Great. Thank you, Mindy. We have a comment from Kathy. It was at 6:54. Again, way more work for families. This is going in the wrong direction. The commitment should be to be lessening the work time required for families. The idea behind the creation of the 525 waiver, which was originally PDMS, was to get the bureaucracy out of our homes. In exchange, families are managing the day-to-day, absorbing the coverage responsibilities when staff doesn't come into work, etc. The move to downshift the responsibilities onto families is backwards thinking. Okay, and next from Kathy Garofalo. For those who have their employees under their own companies and do not use the area agency as payroll, how will this affect them?
Yeah, so some people provide their own employer of record services and they will need to be unbundled as well. So you will need to separate those services, even any employer of record, it's no different whether you're the area agency or any employer of record, you will need to separate your services by your hourly work by service type, and it's going to be billed under that by that service type. So you still need to unbundle all your workers.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question from Amy. Also, you mentioned you are only discussing changes that happen as of July 1st. Will there be more changes come September or later in the year? It sounded that you hinted at that.
Yes, BDS is under a systems change, and there's a number of changes. There's a lot of phases. There's a lot of things that haven't been determined. But yes, there will absolutely be upcoming changes in the next year. What I can tell you is that what I'm sharing with you now, we are currently being told will be in place at least through December. And so then at that juncture, there may be other changes, but this will remain true through December at this time.
Okay, and then we have a question from Jen Bertrand. Do families who have P, C, and H need to make a direct request to BDS to include transportation as a service in a person's budget?
I don't think the request is with BDS. Our contracts indicate that it's inclusive of transportation, which is common. So like, for example, even if you're using a vendor, if you have a vendor provider, their mileage is built into their stipend. So it is typical that any mileage costs were considered when the stipend rate was set. So if that did not occur, you should revisit that with your service coordinator, because contractors don't typically get a separate check for any mileage. You get one rate and it covers all the services that you're providing, and mileage should be considered in that stipend. It's not a separate service for residential.
And Mindy, that's inclusive of a PCNH contract?
Yes. So when you are, we call it personal care and habilitation, difficulty care, parent paid stipend, whatever you regions call them. It's those stipends include all expenses that you're being paid for those services. So it would include mileage if that was applicable to the service, if you're providing that service, which I'm assuming most people would be. But again, it doesn't cover mileage that is to Medicaid covered appointments or covered services, because that's covered by your MCO. But it would cover anything to access, their services in the community, or, visit family, have relationships, those types of travel would be appropriate. And that would be inclusive inside of your stipend.
Thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
Okay, and we have another question in the chat. This is from Leslie. Is the family supervisor responsible for educating the FME on these timesheet reporting changes? And for Region 6, will the payroll application be adjusted to deal with these changes?
So the first question is, I got distracted by the second question. I'm sorry. What was the first question, Karen?
Is the family supervisor responsible for educating the FME on these timesheet reporting changes is part one?
So what I would say to you is yes, as the family manager supervisor, you supervise and train your worker. However, currently in all regions, area agencies are the FMS agency, and they are part of that, whether you are your own employer of record and you submit that to the area agency, or they are your employer of record, they have a responsibility to those workers to ensure that they understand their timekeeping. So it really truly, in New Hampshire, we typically use an agency with choice model, meaning that we're partners in this communication. So it would be a combination of, yes, the supervisor needs to understand it so that they can make sure they set their worker up and they approve the services. But I would suggest it should be a partnership. So for example, we have already trained all of our supervisors and have offered to meet with their families as they come and change help with their services and those types of things. We'll give them individual instructions. We have a PowerPoint that tells them for Region 6, we have a PowerPoint that shows them exactly what to pick and all of that. Each region will get that information out differently, but I think it's fair to expect that your employer of record service would work with you to make sure that those workers are educated, because they're the ones processing the timesheets and all of those things. So yes, in Region 6, we use a Paycom, and it's going to have, they'll just pick, when their name comes up, they'll pick which code based on what services they're assigned to, and it just drops down and they pick which one they want. So.
And if anyone has specific questions about how their area agency does it, please talk to your service coordinator.
Yes, definitely go back to your service coordinator.
All right, we have a question from Barb S. How or where can we find out who our BDS liaison is?
Oh, that's a great question. I believe at this time it's listed on the Bureau of Developmental Services web page. And if you go to BDS, the actual page, there's a list of liaisons there. I know it's in a number of presentations and things people pop, but I think the best place to get that is their website, because they do sometimes have turnover and changes in those positions. So it's good, and it has your region, their contact information, their phone number. But you could also, your area agency will be able to provide that to you as well.
And I'll provide the link to BDS's webpage for that as well.
Perfect.
So that's a great question. And one more question from Vicki. I'm sorry this was already answered, but will transportation for Community Day program need a PA? And honestly, Vicki, we've had so much great information. No worries. Go ahead. Go ahead, Mindy.
Yeah, so you will not get a PA for transportation inside of a day program, because when you fill out your services and your cost expenses for your day service, you're going to include mileage under that service. So the mileage will get billed to CPS, and it will be inside that funding proposal. It's not standalone. The only time it's standalone is like what I shared with Scott, is there is a service called non-medical transport. So it's when someone just needs transportation, they are not receiving any service. So they get dropped off at work and they have the supports that, their coworkers support them at work, or they don't need any support, or you get dropped off to get your groceries and then just picked up, because it's really stinky sometimes to take all your groceries on the city bus. So those types of things, though that is a standalone service. And again, you can work with your service coordinator to review when would it be under service and when might non-medical transportation be appropriate. Non-medical pays for taxis and Uber and city buses for communities who have that, but many communities do not. So definitely.
Okay, so we have 2 more minutes left. Does anyone else have any final questions?
You guys are so excited to go out there and unbundle your services that you don't even have a question. That's wonderful.
Well, it's kind of ironic, this whole situation. I'm talking about bundling services when I keep seeing these Geico ads. I think it's Geico. Is it Geico? Or maybe it's not.
You can bundle your home and
they bundle everything. And there's so many funny memes.
I know
out there, but I can't seem to find any unbundling memes.
I know, you're like, how can I unbundle my service?
Not what the rest of the world is doing right now.
I know. It's pretty interesting. One thing I do want to share, if there's no other questions, is that this is the first time the Bureau of Developmental Services has had an actual participant directed and managed administrator. So Abigail Conger is our administrator for participant directed and managed services. And I'm impressed that the Bureau has recognized the expertise required for this program. And Abby has been working tirelessly during all these changes to make sure that PDMS is still at the forefront. People are used to a traditional model and they create everything for traditional and it doesn't work in participant direction, and then we have to fix it. So it's really nice to know that we have Abby up there, and she's very easy to work with. She comes to our monthly meetings, which is the 3rd Wednesday of the month from 2:30 to 4. We've never had I think Carla did IHS, but we never really had someone dedicated to PDMS. So it's been nice to have Abby in that role. and that the Bureau's taking it seriously. So I think we also have an ally, and Abby's always willing to meet with people in participant direction to hear feedback and to talk things through and bring new scenarios back to say, oh, I think we forgot to think about this. I know starting in the fall, she's thinking of having like another group, a PDMS group, where people can come and ask questions, because we know it's different than traditional. So just wanted to put that out there.
So we have a question from Carol. DSP drives to do grocery shopping and assist in the store, a goal. Can the DSP get reimbursed for mileage?
Yep. So in this situation, that DSP would be able to have mileage reimbursement under the service that they're providing. So if they were doing that under residential, it'd be under residential. If they were doing that under day, their mileage would be under the day program. But yes, because they're staying, that mileage is under the service that it happened, and they're providing support on site.
And our last question from Vicky, and what do we call an unbundle? What is the formal term for it? Yes,
so you're getting an individual prior authorization for each service instead of a consolidated budget approval. So it's separate PAs or prior auths is what you're referring to. The Bureau does call it unbundling of services. In my head, I call it unconsolidating of consolidated budgets, because that's why we created these budgets, is to put them all in, but now we're gonna unbundle them. So yeah, they do actually call it at the Bureau unbundling of the PA, the prior authorization, which now they want to call the service authorization. So some new lingo for us all to learn, but I'll continue to translate and know the new language as I can. Well, I know we're just about time, but I do want to thank everybody, and I want you to know that there's a lot of people that see you and know and want to work alongside you to advocate, as well as give you, like, this point of this information is not the, is this a good idea or that type of stuff. It's to give you information so you can advocate about how it specifically impacts you and your families and concerns you see. So we want to continue doing that. And, you know, the questions are fabulous because it's things we maybe have not thought of or never been asked, so that we can start digging at those things. So do appreciate it. And, you know, we're available anytime. So feel free to reach out.
And we would like to thank you, Mindy, so much for this presentation. It was so informative. Thank you all.
Thank you. We greatly appreciate it, Mindy, by the way.
You're welcome. I'm a geek when it comes to all this stuff. So I was
and let your clients know at Gateway, Route 2 is now back and running